Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Have you ever wondered how quickly a quiet place can lose its silence? How a riverbank known only to a few families can, within months, draw the restless attention of an entire world? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight and what your local time is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Long before thousands of ships pressed toward the Pacific coast, before newspapers shouted headlines and fortunes were imagined in gold dust, California was a distant and uncertain frontier. It was not yet fully American in spirit or structure. Authority had shifted recently from Mexican governance to the expanding United States, and that transition had left confusion rather than stability. Land grants, known as ranchos, stretched across valleys, controlled by Californio families whose wealth was measured more in cattle than in coin. Missions, once central to Spanish colonial life, were fading institutions. Trade moved slowly through small ports, and the population of San Francisco, then called Yerba Buena, was so small that every face was familiar. Ordinary life revolved around livestock, small-scale agriculture, and coastal trade. The political climate was unsettled but not chaotic. The recent war between Mexico and the United States had ended, yet formal statehood had not arrived. Military governors attempted to impose order on a vast territory with little infrastructure. There were no established banks, few courts, and limited federal presence. News from the eastern United States travelled by ship around Cape Horn or across difficult land routes. Months could pass before decisions made in Washington were known on the Pacific coast. In this setting, ambition felt restrained by geography. A young man growing up in the American Midwest might dream of land and independence, but California seemed unimaginably far. Those already living there had modest expectations. Stability, livestock, harvests, and family alliances shaped daily concerns. Wealth, in the dramatic sense, was not yet part of the conversation. That began to change at a sawmill on the American River, owned by a Swiss immigrant named John Sutter and operated by James Marshall. Sutter himself had come west chasing reinvention. He had debts in Europe and hoped that distance would offer renewal. His agricultural empire near the Sacramento Valley depended on labour and careful planning. He wanted lumber for construction, not disruption. Marshall, inspecting the mill race one morning, noticed something unusual glinting in the water. The discovery was quiet. There was no trumpet of triumph, no immediate proclamation. The first reaction was uncertainty. Could this truly be gold? Samples were tested in simple ways, hammered, scratched, examined in light. Confirmation brought not celebration but apprehension. Sutter understood that news of gold would undermine everything he had built. Workers would abandon fields. Discipline would collapse. Order would dissolve. He was correct. At first, secrecy held. A handful of men began collecting flakes from the riverbed. They worked with pans and crude tools, testing the sand and gravel. Word spread in whispers along the Sacramento Valley. Ranch hands left cattle untended. Farm labourers slipped away at dawn. Within weeks, nearby settlements thinned. The broader political atmosphere made control impossible. There was no strong territorial government to regulate claims. Military authority lacked manpower to enforce restrictions. Newspapers in San Francisco eventually printed confirmation. Once printed, rumour hardened into fact. Ships arriving in port carried the news farther. Sailors carried it to Oregon, to Hawaii, to ports along the Pacific. By late 1848, word had reached the eastern United States. For a farmer in Ohio or a clerk in New York, this news arrived during a period of economic anxiety. The Panic of 1837 still lingered in memory. Opportunities for rapid advancement felt limited. The idea that wealth lay scattered in riverbeds waiting only for effort was intoxicating. It suggested freedom from hierarchy, No apprenticeship required, no inheritance necessary, just a pan, strength, and resolve. Yet those who first rushed to the rivers quickly learned that gold did not guarantee comfort. Camps formed along streams with no formal planning. Tents, rough wooden shelters, and canvas lean-tos sprang up wherever deposits seemed promising. Food was scarce, supply chains were unreliable, prices rose sharply because transport from coastal ports required time and risk. Still, hope persisted. A man could work all day and find nothing. Then, in a moment of patience or luck, his pan might reveal flecks bright enough to change his prospects. That possibility sustained exhaustion. California itself transformed in spirit before it transformed in structure. The quiet agricultural province became a magnet for migration. It was not only Americans who felt drawn west. News crossed oceans. Latin American miners, experienced in placer techniques, arrived early. Soon after came Australians, Europeans, and eventually migrants from China. The riverbanks became multilingual and competitive. Within a year, the psychological landscape shifted. The region no longer felt peripheral. It felt central, at least in imagination. The federal government, initially slow to respond, recognized that enormous economic change was underway, yet law lagged behind movement. Informal codes governed mining claims. Men marked boundaries with stakes or simple agreements. Disputes were settled by makeshift meetings, sometimes calmly, sometimes not. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, the small port town began to feel pressure. Ships arriving from around the world unloaded passengers who often abandoned their vessels immediately to head inland. Crews deserted. Captains found themselves without sailors. Some ships were left anchored and unused, gradually becoming floating relics in the harbour. The transformation was not yet fully visible, but it had begun. A settlement that once counted a few hundred residents would soon count thousands. Streets would expand. Warehouses would multiply. Structures would be built quickly, sometimes carelessly. But at this early stage, the future remained uncertain. Gold had been found, yes, but how much? For how long? Would the deposits endure? Those first months carried a particular tension, not dramatic, but practical. Men calculated risk. Should they sell livestock to buy equipment? Should they leave family behind? Should they trust rumours of richer streams deeper in the hills? The environment shaped their decisions. California's rivers swelled and shrank with seasons. Winter rains made travel difficult. Summer heat dried smaller creeks. The land itself determined opportunity. And yet, beneath practical considerations, something more subtle moved through those early camps. It was the belief that identity could be rewritten. A failed merchant might become prosperous. A labourer might claim independence. The gold rush was not only about metal, it was about possibility. In time, that possibility would collide with reality. Wealth would concentrate in unexpected places. Merchants would earn steady profit while miners faced uncertainty. Political debates over slavery and free labour would intensify as California sought statehood. Entire communities would be displaced. Environmental scars would widen. But in these first quiet months, beside the American River, none of that was fully visible. There was only the sound of water, the scrape of pans against gravel, and the steady calculation of men weighing hope against exhaustion. If you had stood there, at the edge of that river, watching a stranger kneel in the current, would you have believed that this simple act, washing sand through a metal pan, would redraw maps and alter economies across continents? History often begins not with spectacle, but with a decision that seems small at the time. A man bends to examine a glint in water. Another decides to leave home. A port town prepares for ships it does not yet see. California had not always felt remote. For the Spanish crown, it had once represented strategic ambition, a northern frontier meant to secure empire against rival powers. Missions were established along the coast beginning in the late 18th century, intended to convert native peoples to Christianity and integrate them into colonial society. These missions shaped daily rhythms for decades. Bells marked work and prayer. Agriculture supported growing settlements. Authority flowed through church and crown alike. By the early 19th century, Spanish rule gave way to Mexican governance. Independence from Spain brought political change, but not immediate prosperity. Ranchos expanded across fertile valleys, granted to Californio families who developed a cattle-based economy. Hides and tallow became major exports, shipped to distant markets. Life centered on livestock management, seasonal gatherings, and extended family networks. Wealth existed, but it was rooted in land ownership rather than commerce. Ordinary people, ranch hands, artisans, small farmers lived with modest expectations. Social hierarchies were clear. California elites maintained influence, while native communities, already diminished by disease and displacement, faced shrinking autonomy. Trade was slow, travel slower still. A journey from the East Coast to California could take months by sea or overland trail. Religious belief remained woven into daily life. Catholic traditions structured festivals and obligations. Community identity often revolved around parish and extended kinship. Even after Mexico secularized the missions, spiritual life retained its presence. Decisions about marriage, property, and alliance were shaped by inherited customs. Then came the United States-Mexico War. American settlers had begun arriving in increasing numbers, drawn by land opportunities and influenced by the doctrine of manifest destiny. Tensions grew between Mexican authorities and these new arrivals. By 1846, conflict escalated. Military engagements were brief in California compared to other theaters, but the outcome was decisive. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo transferred the vast territory to the United States. The transfer brought uncertainty rather than clarity. Military governors replaced Mexican officials. Land titles required review. American legal concepts began to overlay older property systems. Californios, who once felt secure, now questioned the durability of their claims. Native communities faced further marginalization as American expansion intensified. At this moment of transition, before gold transformed everything, California was suspended between identities. It was American in law, but not yet in infrastructure. There were few courts, minimal taxation systems, and no established state government. Communication with Washington remained slow. Authority was often improvised. San Francisco, still modest in size, reflected this in-between condition. Wooden buildings clustered near the harbour. Dirt streets turned to mud during rains. Merchants handled hides, imported goods, and limited manufactured items. The population hovered around a few hundred residents in the mid-1840s. Everyone knew the harbour's rhythms, ships arriving with supplies, departing with cargo. Life was practical, predictable. Inland, ranchos stretched across valleys where cattle roamed freely. Social gatherings were seasonal. Branding days, religious festivals, and family celebrations punctuated the calendar. The economy revolved around livestock rather than currency. Gold existed in the earth, but it was not yet a defining feature of identity. For American settlers already present before 1848, ambition mixed with caution. They had crossed difficult terrain to establish farms and trading posts. They sought stability, not upheaval. The discovery at Sutter's mill threatened that stability. Labourers abandoned agricultural work. Ranch employees drifted toward rivers. Fields risked neglect. Sutter himself watched his enterprise unravel. He had envisioned an agricultural empire supplying growing settlements. Instead, workers departed to pursue quick wealth. Contracts dissolved. Discipline weakened. The political vacuum made enforcement nearly impossible. As news spread beyond California, the territory's uncertain governance became more significant. The United States had not yet fully organized the region into a state. There were no clear mining regulations from federal authority. Property rights regarding mineral wealth were undefined. In practice, miners created their own codes, local agreements that determined claim size and enforcement mechanisms. These informal systems reflected American traditions of frontier self-governance. Meetings were held where miners voted on rules. Claim boundaries were measured in paces. Absence from a claim for a specified period could result in forfeiture. Though imperfect, these codes reduced some conflict in early months. At the same time, social tensions simmered beneath the surface. Californios, who had lived under Mexican law, now navigated American expectations. Language differences complicated legal processes. Cultural misunderstandings widened gaps between long-established families and incoming migrants. Native Californian communities faced the most severe consequences. Already weakened by decades of disease and forced labor under mission systems, they now confronted new waves of intrusion. River valleys that had sustained them for generations filled with miners who saw land primarily as resource. Daily life shifted gradually at first, then rapidly. Agricultural production declined as labor left for mining camps. Prices for goods began to rise because supply could not match growing demand. Merchants recognized opportunity. Imported items, tools, clothing, preserved food could command extraordinary prices once thousands arrived. The broader American political climate also influenced developments. The nation was already wrestling with sectional tensions over slavery. The question of whether California would enter the Union as a free or slave state carried national implications. The gold discovery accelerated urgency. A territory rich in resources could not remain administratively undefined for long. For individuals living through this moment, decisions were personal before they were political. A ranch hand weighing whether to leave his employer for the river was thinking about survival and hope, not congressional debates. A merchant considering increased inventory was calculating profit, not sectional balance. Yet their choices collectively reshaped national discourse. Climate and geography continued to exert quiet control. The Sierra Nevada mountains separated river valleys from coastal settlements. Travel required stamina and planning. Rivers fluctuated with season. Early miners relied on simple panning techniques, which demanded patience rather than machinery. Work was repetitive. Success was uneven. The cultural values of the time emphasized self-reliance and risk-taking. American society admired the individual who seized opportunity. Stories of sudden wealth circulated quickly. Even exaggerated accounts fueled migration. Newspapers on the East Coast printed letters from California describing gold lying openly in streams. Skeptics existed, but curiosity prevailed. Meanwhile, San Francisco prepared, though it did not yet fully grasp what was coming. Its harbor would soon become crowded beyond imagination. Its streets would expand unpredictably. Structures would be erected in haste, but at this stage, the town remained small enough that a newcomer's arrival was noticeable. California stood at a threshold. It was neither the quiet ranching province of earlier decades, nor yet the booming epicenter of global migration it would soon become. It was a landscape of possibility layered atop fragility. Governance incomplete, infrastructure minimal, expectations rising. If one had paused in those months before the great influx of 1,849, one might have sensed tension in subtle ways. Fewer workers in fields, more conversation about rivers, increased speculation about land value. Yet daily routine still resembled the past more than the future. Change often gathers quietly before it becomes visible. In California, political transition had already unsettled long-standing systems. Gold would accelerate that transformation beyond anyone's ability to control it. The province was no longer distant in imagination. It was becoming central in ambition. By the time the first substantial shipments of gold reached the eastern United States, doubt had already begun to erode. At first, many dismissed the reports as exaggeration. Frontier rumors were common. Newspapers often printed speculative accounts to boost circulation. But when official confirmation arrived, when President James K. Polk himself acknowledged the discovery in a message to Congress, the tone changed. Skepticism gave way to calculation. The announcement did not create desire. It validated it. Across the United States, Individuals who had long felt confined by circumstance began to reconsider their futures. Economic mobility in the mid-19th century was uneven. Land ownership required capital, professions required apprenticeship. Urban labour could be repetitive and poorly paid. The idea that gold could be gathered with one's own hands suggested an alternative path. Information travelled unevenly but persistently. Ships carried newspapers from New York to ports along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. From there, copies circulated inland by river and rail. Letters from early miners were reprinted, sometimes without verification. Each account seemed to confirm the same possibility. Gold was abundant, and it was accessible. The psychological effect was profound. Men who had never seen California began discussing routes across plains and mountains. Merchants studied maps. Ministers debated whether such pursuit of wealth reflected providence or temptation. Families weighed the risk of separation. Entire communities held meetings to consider collective departure. The phrase 49er would soon describe those who left in 1849, but the impulse began earlier. In late 1848, small groups departed by sea, sailing around Cape Horn or through Panama. Overland parties organized in Missouri and Illinois. Equipment lists circulated in newspapers: pans, picks, shovels, sturdy boots, preserved food. Some purchased entire wagons stocked with provisions. Others set out with little more than hope. The scale of migration was unprecedented for the United States at that time. It was not organized by government decree or corporate enterprise. It was voluntary, decentralized, and driven by personal ambition. The federal government, though aware of events, did not orchestrate the movement. Individuals assumed responsibility for their own risk. In Europe, the news also took hold. Economic hardship in parts of Germany and Ireland made emigration appealing. Ships departing from London and Hamburg carried passengers bound for a Pacific coast many had only read about. Australia, with its own history of penal colonies and economic experimentation, saw young men depart for California before gold was even discovered in Victoria. China, too, would soon be drawn into the movement. Though migration from southern China to California intensified slightly later, early reports reached coastal communities through trade networks. For many facing poverty and instability, the idea of Gold Mountain offered hope. As rumours solidified into reality, infrastructure began to strain. Ports on the Atlantic coast saw increased demand for passage. Prices for shipping rose sharply. Overland routes required coordination. Guidebooks were printed advising on river crossings and mountain passes. Some advice was practical, some dangerously optimistic. Back in California, those already mining experienced both advantage and anxiety. Early arrivals could claim richer streams before competition intensified, yet they also faced isolation and supply shortages. With no established banking system, gold dust functioned as currency. Weighing scales became essential tools. Trust depended on reputation, which was fragile in transient communities. The environment responded to human movement. Riverbanks that had been quiet filled with tents and rough cabins. Trails widened from repeated travel. Trees were cut for construction and fuel. Wildlife retreated from areas of concentrated activity. The social composition of camps grew more complex. Americans from different states brought varied customs and expectations. Southerners and Northerners worked side by side, though national tensions simmered beneath cooperation. Latin American miners, experienced in placer techniques, sometimes outperformed newcomers unfamiliar with river methods. This occasionally bred resentment. Competition for claims intensified. Political authority remained thin. With no formal state government yet established, miners relied on meetings to resolve disputes. These assemblies reflected American democratic traditions but lacked consistency. Decisions could vary from camp to camp. Enforcement depended on collective will. Meanwhile, San Francisco felt the first visible signs of transformation. Ships arriving in the harbour unloaded passengers who often departed immediately for inland fields. Many crew members deserted their posts. unwilling to continue maritime labour when gold seemed within reach. Vessels were left anchored, some later repurposed as storage facilities or even makeshift buildings along the waterfront. The harbour gradually accumulated abandoned ships, silent witnesses to a population in motion. Economic patterns shifted rapidly. Basic goods became scarce as demand surged. Flour, tools and clothing commanded prices far beyond their cost in Eastern markets. Merchants who had once traded modestly now found opportunity in scarcity. Some quickly ordered additional inventory, anticipating profit. Others hesitated, unsure whether the boom would endure. For individuals contemplating departure from the East, decisions were rarely impulsive. Letters were written home explaining intent. Debts were settled or postponed. Some sold farms or businesses to finance the journey. Others borrowed heavily, wagering future gold on present expense. Not all who departed were young and unmarried. Fathers left families behind with promises to return within a year. Brothers formed partnerships to share risk. The cultural climate encouraged boldness. American society celebrated frontier expansion as proof of national vitality. Religious sermons sometimes framed the opportunity as providential blessing. Yet, cautionary voices existed. Some warned of moral decline in lawless camps. Others questioned the sustainability of mineral wealth. For those who had never travelled far from home, the decision to head west represented more than economic calculation. It required psychological separation from familiarity. The plains, deserts, and mountains between Missouri and California were not minor obstacles. They were formidable landscapes with limited infrastructure. Illness, accident, and supply failure were real threats. Yet the promise of gold compressed perceived distance. The map of North America seemed to shrink under the force of ambition. California, once distant in imagination, became central in conversation. Newspapers devoted entire columns to routes and testimonials. Public meetings debated logistics. Outfitting businesses expanded rapidly. In California, the initial phase of the gold rush, sometimes called the Rush of 48, would soon be eclipsed by the massive influx of 1849. But at this stage, anticipation dominated. The population had begun to grow, but the overwhelming wave had not yet fully arrived. For those standing at docks in New York or New Orleans, watching ships depart, the horizon represented both danger and possibility. They carried expectations shaped by rumour and reinforced by official acknowledgement. Few understood the full complexity awaiting them: competition, inflated prices, physical exhaustion, and political instability. Hope can travel faster than fact. In late 1848 and early 1849, hope crossed oceans and plains with remarkable speed. It did not require certainty. It required only the belief that effort might be rewarded. California's rivers continued to flow as they always had, indifferent to human excitement. Yet along their banks, a new chapter was forming not through proclamation, but through accumulation. Each departure from an eastern town, each ship leaving harbour, each wagon assembling on the frontier, added to momentum that would soon reshape not only a territory, but a nation's future. As winter turned towards spring in 1849, departure ceased to be an abstract idea and became an organised movement. In towns along the Mississippi River, wagons were repaired, oxen purchased, flour packed into barrels. Blacksmiths worked longer hours fitting iron rims to wheels. General stores displayed picks and shovels beside seed and sugar. The economy of preparation expanded before a single nugget was seen. The decision to leave was rarely simple. For a farmer in Illinois, the land represented continuity. Fields had been cleared with effort. Fences had been raised by hand. To abandon that stability for a rumour required an inner shift. Some justified it as temporary absence one season in California, then return with capital sufficient to improve the farm. Others framed it as escape from stagnation. Younger sons without inheritance felt particular urgency. The gold rush offered an opportunity to bypass established hierarchies. Clerks in eastern cities faced different pressures. Urban employment provided wages but little advancement. Apprenticeships required years of patient labour before independence. The idea that physical endurance alone could generate wealth appealed to those weary of structured routines. In boarding houses and taverns, conversations turned increasingly toward routes west. Immigrants newly arrived in the United States confronted their own calculations. Many had already endured transatlantic voyages in search of better prospects. The notion of travelling still farther, to a Pacific coast few had seen, required courage and perhaps a certain restlessness. Yet economic hardship in parts of Europe made the risk seem reasonable. Some saw California as a second chance within a new nation. Financial preparation exposed inequalities. Wealthier participants could afford full outfitting. Wagons stocked with provisions for months, spare animals, medical supplies. Others pooled resources in partnerships. Groups formed agreements to share tools and divide findings equally. These partnerships reflected both trust and necessity. Isolation on the trail could prove fatal. Routes varied. The overland trail from Missouri became one of the most travelled. Wagon trains gathered in staging towns, waiting for favourable weather before crossing the Great Plains. Guides offered advice, sometimes reliable, sometimes speculative. Distances were measured in weeks and months rather than miles. Those choosing the sea route faced a different calculation. Sailing around Cape Horn required endurance and patience. Voyages could last 5 months or longer. Conditions aboard ships were crowded. Food quality varied. Storms near the southern tip of South America tested vessels and morale. Yet for some, sea travel felt preferable to desert crossings and mountain passes. A third route, across the Isthmus of Panama, combined sea and land travel. Passengers sailed to the Caribbean side, crossed dense jungle by canoe and mule, then boarded ships on the Pacific coast. Disease posed serious risk in tropical climate. Cholera and malaria claimed lives before California was even reached. Families often remained behind. Wives managed farms or boarding houses in the absence of husbands. Letters promised swift return. These letters reveal mixed emotions, confidence layered over uncertainty. A father might assure his children that gold lay waiting, yet privately question whether absence would weaken family bonds. Religious considerations influenced decisions. Some ministers encouraged congregants to seek honest opportunity, provided they maintained moral discipline. Others warned against greed. Yet even among the cautious, few denied the transformative potential of the discovery. Cultural values of independence and self-determination reinforced the impulse. The United States had expanded steadily westward for decades. The gold rush felt like continuation rather than rupture. If land had once drawn settlers, now mineral wealth did. In California, the growing influx began to strain existing communities. Ranch owners lost labourers who departed for rivers. Agricultural production declined as manpower shifted toward mining. Prices for food rose accordingly. A simple sack of flour could command several times its previous value. Those who had not yet joined the rush felt pressure from neighbours who had. San Francisco's harbour saw increasing traffic. Ships arrived more frequently, carrying passengers from distant ports. Many who stepped ashore did not intend to remain in the city. They planned to proceed inland as quickly as possible. Yet the city itself began to change simply by serving as entry point. Economic speculation intensified. Land values rose as investors anticipated expansion. Temporary structures were erected quickly to house newcomers. Lumber was scarce, construction often improvised. Fires occasionally broke out, exposing the vulnerability of hastily built districts. For those still en route, news of others' departures reinforced momentum. Wagon trains leaving Missouri sometimes stretched for miles. The sight of so many travellers provided reassurance. If thousands were willing to attempt the journey, perhaps risk was manageable. Daily life on the trail required discipline. Wagons were loaded carefully to balance weight. Water sources determined campsites. Food had to be rationed. Illness spread easily in crowded conditions. When cholera struck some wagon trains, fear travelled alongside disease. Graves dotted sections of the trail, marked by simple stones or wooden crosses. Yet even amid hardship, anticipation sustained morale. Evenings around campfires were filled with conversation about future plans. Some imagined purchasing large tracts of land upon return. Others planned to invest in businesses. The details varied, but the underlying expectation was consistent. Effort would lead to improvement. Back in eastern towns, departure altered social fabric. Labour shortages emerged in certain trades. Businesses adapted. Newspapers printed letters from those already on the trail, offering both encouragement and warning. Advice columns detailed which supplies to bring and which mistakes to avoid. Political leaders observed with mixed reactions. On one hand, migration reinforced national expansion. On the other, the sudden population shift toward a territory not yet formally organized into a state raised constitutional questions. Debates over slavery's expansion intensified as it became clear that California's future status would influence sectional balance. The psychological dimension of departure deserves attention. Leaving home in the mid-19th century was not a trivial act. Communication was slow. Death along the trail was common enough to be acknowledged openly. Those who left understood that reunion was uncertain, yet the belief in personal agency, so central to American identity, made the risk acceptable. Some individuals hesitated too long and found themselves left behind. They watched neighbours depart and wondered whether caution would cost them opportunity. Others departed impulsively, only to regret insufficient preparation. By late spring and summer of 1849, the overland trails were crowded beyond precedent. The journey itself became a proving ground. Ambition that had seemed abstract in a newspaper headline now faced sun, dust, hunger, and fatigue, yet the flow continued. California, meanwhile, braced for impact it could not fully anticipate. The quiet rivers of the previous year were about to host thousands. Camps would multiply, competition would sharpen, infrastructure would strain. Those who left home carried more than tools. They carried expectations shaped by rumour, reinforced by official acknowledgement, and sustained by cultural belief in upward mobility. Whether those expectations would be met remained uncertain. History often records migration in numbers, but behind each departure stood a private calculation, a weighing of stability against possibility, of comfort against ambition. In 1849, countless individuals chose possibility. For those who chose the overland trail, California was not reached in a moment of excitement but in stages of endurance. The journey west began across open prairie that seemed almost manageable in early weeks. Grasslands stretched wide beneath an unbroken sky. Wagons creaked steadily forward. Rivers were crossed carefully, sometimes with the help of ferries, sometimes by improvisation. At first, the movement felt orderly, but distance reshaped perception. Days blurred into one another. The Platte River guided many travellers, its shallow flow offering both direction and water. Yet even along this relative comfort, danger existed. Cholera moved through wagon trains in waves. A healthy man could fall ill in the morning and be buried by evening. The cause was poorly understood. Contaminated water and crowded conditions contributed, but prevention methods were limited. Fear accompanied each new cough. Food required strict management. Flour, bacon, beans, and coffee formed staples. Fresh meat was rare unless hunters succeeded. Oxen weakened under heavy loads. When animals died, wagons were lightened. Personal belongings, chairs, trunks, even keepsakes were discarded along the trail to reduce weight. The path west gradually became lined with the remnants of expectation. As the plains gave way to arid stretches, heat intensified. The Humboldt River, a key route through present-day Nevada, offered guidance but little comfort. Water quality deteriorated in late summer. Animals drank reluctantly. Travelers learned that thirst could distort judgment. Some pushed ahead too quickly, exhausting teams and supplies. Others lingered too long, losing momentum. The mountains presented final trial. The Sierra Nevada stood as barrier and gateway. Snow lingered into early summer in some passes. Late departures risked entrapment by early winter storms. Memories of the Donner Party tragedy only a few years earlier remained vivid warnings. Timing was critical. Those who chose sea routes encountered different hardships. Sailing around Cape Horn exposed ships to violent storms. Months at sea tested patience and health. Scurvy appeared when fresh produce ran out. Morale fluctuated with weather. Some ships experienced mutinous tension when captains enforced discipline while passengers dreamed of gold. The Panama route, though shorter in distance, brought its own hazards. Crossing the isthmus required navigating rivers choked with vegetation and travelling through humid jungle where disease thrived. Cholera and malaria claimed lives. Travellers who survived often arrived in California weakened. Throughout all routes, anticipation sustained movement. Each hardship endured was framed as temporary, an investment toward imagined prosperity. Letters written during the journey reveal this mindset. Even when describing illness or loss, writers often reassured recipients that reward justified risk. Approaching California by sea, travellers first glimpsed the coastline framed by fog and rugged hills. The Golden Gate Strait, named decades earlier for reasons unrelated to mineral wealth, suddenly seemed prophetic. It had been named Chrysopole, meaning Golden Gate, by explorer John C. Fremont in the 1840s, envisioning it as a gateway to Pacific trade. Now it became literal passageway to goldfields. Ships passed through its narrow opening into the harbour of San Francisco, carrying expectations from across the world. The harbour itself bore evidence of transformation. As passenger ships arrived, many crew members deserted to pursue mining. Vessels were abandoned at anchor. Some were later hauled ashore and repurposed into storage warehouses, boarding houses, or shops. Others slowly decayed where they rested. Over time, land reclamation projects buried several beneath what would become the financial district. Beneath modern streets lie remnants of those ships, evidence of a moment when maritime discipline yielded to mineral ambition. Those arriving overland descended from mountain passes into valleys that felt both welcoming and chaotic. The Sacramento Valley, once defined by ranchos and sparse settlements, now bustled with movement. Trails branched toward various rivers, American, Yuba, Feather. Each promised deposits, though quality varied. The physical toll of travel shaped first impressions. Emaciated oxen, sunburned faces, worn clothing marked arrivals. Some reached mining camps with little remaining strength. Supplies were often depleted. Prices for essentials in California exceeded expectations. A shovel that cost a few dollars in the East might cost several times that amount upon arrival. The political environment remained unsettled. California was still a territory without formal state government. Military authorities attempted oversight but lacked resources to manage the influx. Informal mining codes governed claim allocation. Camps established their own rules regarding claim size and dispute resolution. For many, the first sight of gold did not come immediately. Weeks might pass before locating a promising claim. Competition intensified as thousands spread along riverbanks. Early arrivals had secured some of the richest surface deposits. Later comers often worked areas already disturbed, hoping for overlooked flecks. The journey itself altered character. Those who began as clerks or farmers developed practical skills in navigation, hunting, and survival. Partnerships formed during travel sometimes endured in camps. Shared hardship created bonds that replaced hometown familiarity. Yet not all who endured the journey found satisfaction. Some arrived only to discover that reality diverged from expectation. Wealth required sustained effort. Luck played role. Physical stamina mattered. The romantic image of gold lying openly in streams had been partly true at first. Now it was less so. San Francisco, receiving both sea and land arrivals, felt strain acutely. The population swelled rapidly. Temporary housing proved insufficient. tents lined streets, makeshift buildings rose quickly. Lumber shortages inflated costs. Fires occasionally destroyed entire blocks, forcing rapid rebuilding. Economic opportunity extended beyond mining. Transporting goods from port to interior became lucrative. Entrepreneurs organized mule trains to carry supplies upriver. Warehouses multiplied along the waterfront. Speculation in land and services sometimes proved more profitable than panning itself. For the individuals who had crossed plains or oceans, arrival did not bring rest. It marked the beginning of another phase. The physical journey ended. The economic trial began. The Golden Gate, once geographic feature on a map, now functioned as symbolic threshold. To pass through it was to commit fully to the experiment. Whether fortune awaited beyond was uncertain. If you had stood on the deck of a ship entering that narrow strait after months at sea, would you have felt triumph or apprehension? The hills ahead concealed rivers and camps where competition awaited. The harbour behind held abandoned ships, silent reminders that plans could change quickly. By late 1849, tens of thousands had made the journey. California was no longer peripheral. It was central in global imagination. The long road west had transformed ambition into action, and the land now carried the weight of that decision. Arrival at the diggings did not resemble arrival at a town. There were no orderly streets or established squares, no permanent storefronts or churches with steeples marking the horizon. Instead, there were rivers cutting through gravel beds, canvas tents anchored with stones, rough wooden shacks assembled from whatever lumber could be secured, and men already bent over the current, working with focused repetition. The first lesson was practical. Gold did not leap into one's hands. It required method. Most miners began with a simple pan, shallow, wide, made of metal or wood. Gravel scooped from the riverbed was swirled with water so that lighter sediment washed away, leaving heavier particles behind. The process demanded patience. Too much haste sent flakes downstream. Too little energy left sand unseparated. Those who arrived later, after surface deposits were diminished, learned quickly that panning alone rarely produced sustained returns. Rockers, also called cradle boxes, appeared in camps. These wooden devices allowed miners to process larger quantities of gravel. One man shoveled dirt into the box while another rocked it gently, water washing lighter material away. Long toms, larger sluicing structures soon followed. Mining grew more labour-intensive, not less. Daily routine settled into rhythm. Miners rose early, often before sunrise, to secure favourable spots along riverbanks. Work continued for long hours, interrupted only by brief meals. Evenings were reserved for weighing gold dust and recording findings. Without formal banks, dust was stored in small leather pouches or tin containers. Trust in measurement was essential. Scales became central instruments in camp life. Food was rarely abundant. Supply chains struggled to meet demand. What could be obtained commanded high prices. At one point, eggs became so scarce that they sold for as much as $1 each, a remarkable sum in the mid-19th century, equivalent to roughly $30 in modern value. A miner holding a single egg faced calculation: eat it for nourishment or trade it for supplies more likely to increase future earnings. Breakfast itself could feel like luxury. Stories circulated of a miner who, after striking a promising claim near Placerville, then known as Hangtown, ordered an extravagant meal in celebration. He requested an omelette filled with oysters and bacon, ingredients imported at great expense. The dish, later called the Hangtown fry, became local legend. It symbolized how quickly scarcity and excess could coexist in the same landscape. Clothing reflected adaptation. Standard garments worn from the east proved insufficient for sustained labor. Heavy boots wore down quickly in gravel and mud. Shirts tore easily. In San Francisco, a merchant named Levi Strauss recognized opportunity not in gold itself, but in durability. He began supplying sturdy work trousers made from tough fabric. These early denim jeans met the practical needs of miners who required resilience in clothing as much as in spirit. What began as utilitarian workwear would, in time, become an iconic garment far removed from its riverbank origins. Shelter varied widely. Some miners built small cabins from timber cut nearby. Others relied on tents that leaked during rain. Winters in the Sierra foothills could be cold and wet. Floods occasionally swept through camps, washing away claims and possessions alike. Those who had invested months of labour into a specific stretch of river sometimes found it reshaped overnight by natural forces. Sanitation posed ongoing challenge. Camps were rarely planned with drainage or waste disposal in mind. Illness spread easily. Dysentery, scurvy and respiratory ailments were common. Medical care depended on itinerant doctors or fellow miners with rudimentary knowledge. Many relied on home remedies brought from distant states or countries. Despite hardship, communities formed. Men organised informal meetings to establish claim boundaries and resolve disputes. Notices were posted on rough boards describing local rules. The absence of formal government encouraged self-governance, though enforcement relied on collective agreement rather than institutional authority. Cultural diversity became visible along the rivers. Latin American miners, particularly from Mexico and Chile, often brought prior experience in placer mining. Their techniques influenced camp practices. Chinese immigrants, arriving in increasing numbers after 1850, developed distinct communities within the broader mining environment. They frequently reworked claims abandoned by others, extracting smaller but steady returns. Tension accompanied diversity. Competition for limited deposits sometimes turned hostile. Local regulations occasionally targeted foreign miners with special taxes or restrictions. The California legislature would later formalize some of these discriminatory measures, reflecting broader social anxieties. Economic hierarchy emerged quickly. While individual miners pursued fortune, merchants supplying tools and food often achieved more consistent profit. A miner might spend weeks extracting modest amounts of gold only to spend much of it on inflated supplies. Meanwhile, a storekeeper who maintained inventory and pricing discipline could accumulate steady wealth. Evenings in camp revealed another dimension of life. After long hours of labour, some gathered to share news from distant states. Letters were read aloud. Newspapers, weeks or months old, circulated widely. Saloons, often little more than canvas-covered structures with wooden counters, offered drink and distraction. Gambling tables appeared wherever sufficient gold dust could be wagered. Alcohol consumption rose with exhaustion and uncertainty. Drinking provided temporary relief from physical strain and from the persistent awareness that fortune might remain elusive. Yet not all camps were dominated by disorder. Many maintained codes of conduct, emphasizing fairness in claim enforcement and punishment for theft. Religious observance varied. Some miners organized informal Sunday services. Others neglected spiritual practice amid pursuit of wealth. Ministers occasionally traveled between camps, offering sermons beneath open sky. They reminded listeners that material success did not guarantee moral satisfaction. Weather shaped productivity. During dry seasons, water levels dropped, limiting panning opportunities. Some miners diverted streams to expose riverbeds. These efforts required cooperation and engineering improvisation. The landscape began to bear marks of human alteration. Time altered expectations. Early arrivals sometimes achieved impressive returns from surface deposits. Later, miners faced diminishing prospects. As competition intensified, the narrative of easy wealth faded. Persistence replaced optimism as defining trait. Life in the diggings was not glamorous. It was repetitive, uncertain, physically demanding. Yet for many, it also represented autonomy. A miner answered primarily to himself and to camp rules he had helped establish. That sense of independence, even amid hardship, sustained commitment. If you had laboured all day in cold river water, your hands raw from gravel, would you have measured success by ounces collected, or by the simple fact that you were directing your own effort? The diggings taught lessons not printed in newspapers. They revealed that wealth required endurance, cooperation, and adaptation. They exposed limits of rumour. They fostered communities built on necessity rather than tradition. By the early 1850s, tens of thousands were engaged in this daily rhythm. California's rivers no longer flowed quietly. They carried the sound of shovels, rocker boxes, and measured hope. The longer the gold rush continued, the clearer a difficult truth became. For most miners, survival required more attention than fortune. The image of nuggets scattered generously across riverbeds had faded. What remained was labour that demanded strength and offered uncertain return. Inflation reshaped expectations almost immediately. Goods transported across thousands of miles or around continents arrived with price tags that startled even seasoned traders. A shovel, essential for digging, could cost several times its original price in eastern cities. Boots wore down quickly in rocky terrain and needed replacing. Replacement meant expense. Flour, coffee, bacon basic items consumed much of what a miner earned in dust. The egg became symbol of this imbalance. In some camps, eggs sold for $1 apiece. That single coin represented hours of panning. To eat an egg was to sacrifice potential investment. To trade it was to acknowledge that nourishment and profit were often in tension. Meals rarely resembled those left behind at home. Beans boiled in tin pots, salt pork fried in iron pans, hard bread softened with water, these formed the diet of many. When a miner did strike a richer claim, celebration followed swiftly. Yet such success was uneven and unpredictable. The story of the Hangtown Fry, an omelette stuffed with oysters and bacon, ordered by a miner flush with sudden wealth, circulated precisely because it was unusual. Imported oysters required complex transport. Bacon, though more common, still cost dearly in remote camps. To order both together was declaration of temporary triumph. But for every celebratory meal, there were countless evenings of rationed beans and coffee. Scurvy appeared when fresh produce was absent for months. Some miners cultivated small gardens near camps, though soil and climate did not always cooperate. Supply wagons occasionally arrived with vegetables from coastal farms, and prices soared accordingly. Housing did little to protect against weather. Winter rains soaked canvas tents. Mud thickened around camps. Rivers flooded, sweeping away makeshift shelters and claims. Those who had laboured for weeks on a particular stretch sometimes found it altered beyond recognition after heavy storms. Nature enforced its own terms. Illness compounded hardship. Dysentery spread where sanitation was neglected. Cholera outbreaks occasionally appeared, carried by new arrivals. Medical care was scarce and expensive. A miner, incapacitated by illness, could not work. Without work, there was no income. Partnerships sometimes dissolved under strain when one member could not contribute equally. Psychological strain accompanied physical fatigue. Letters from miners increasingly revealed homesickness. Initial enthusiasm gave way to sober reflection. Some confessed disappointment that gold required so much effort. Others admitted envy toward merchants who seemed to prosper steadily. The economy of camps reflected this imbalance. While miners chased uncertain gains, storekeepers and service providers benefited from constant demand. A merchant who stocked reliable inventory could charge high prices with minimal risk. Transporters who hauled goods from San Francisco to interior camps earned steady wages. Blacksmiths repairing tools found consistent work. Entrepreneurial adaptation extended beyond tools and food. Entertainment became business. Gambling halls emerged in larger camps. Games of chance offered distraction and the illusion of accelerated wealth. Losses could be severe, yet the possibility of quick gain, even through cards or dice, mirrored the broader ethos of the rush. San Francisco, serving as supply hub, reflected these economic dynamics. Its growth was extraordinary. In 1846, the town's population had hovered around 200 residents. By 1852, it had surged to more than 35,000. Entire streets and neighbourhoods appeared almost overnight. The speed of expansion earned it the nickname Instant City. Wooden buildings rose rapidly, sometimes before proper foundations were prepared. The harbour became crowded beyond precedent. Abandoned ships, left by crews who deserted for the mines, accumulated in the bay. Some were dismantled and repurposed into buildings along the waterfront. Others were gradually buried as land was filled in to accommodate expansion. Beneath what would later become the financial district lay hulls of vessels that once crossed oceans in pursuit of trade, only to be claimed by ambition ashore. Boomtown culture extended to saloons. By the early 1850s, San Francisco counted more than 1,000 drinking establishments. Alcohol flowed freely. These spaces offered companionship and temporary escape from uncertainty. They also contributed to disorder. Vigilante groups would later form partly in response to perceived lawlessness fueled by rapid growth. Innovation accompanied expansion. Even in this atmosphere of improvisation, invention thrived. The first mechanical slot machine would eventually be developed in San Francisco, reflecting the city's appetite for risk and novelty. Though appearing later in the century, its origins in this environment of speculation connected gambling to the broader narrative of chance. Back in mining camps, survival required discipline. Those who carefully managed earnings, saving rather than spending recklessly, had better prospects. Yet restraint was difficult in a culture defined by risk. A miner who had laboured weeks for modest gain might wager it in a single evening, hoping to multiply returns. Clothing continued to adapt. Durable denim trousers gained popularity precisely because they reduced replacement cost. Levi Strauss's business grew not from prospecting but from recognizing that thousands required reliable workwear. The miner's environment shaped fashion in practical ways that would echo far beyond California. As months turned to years, some miners recognized that consistent livelihood might lie elsewhere. A few left the diggings to open boarding houses, bakeries, or transport services. The dream of striking it rich gave way to steady enterprise. Others, unwilling to abandon hope, moved from camp to camp, chasing rumors of new discoveries. Social divisions sharpened. Native Californians suffered violence and displacement as mining encroached on traditional lands. Foreign miners faced discriminatory taxes and hostility. The pursuit of gold intensified competition and exposed prejudices. Yet amid hardship, resilience persisted. Men learned to read rivers more skillfully. Techniques improved. Cooperation in diverting streams or constructing sluices required organization and shared labor. Camps developed reputations for fairness or severity in enforcing rules. If one listened closely in the evenings, after tools were set aside, the conversation had changed from early optimism. It was no longer about how quickly wealth would be secured, but about how long one could endure. Survival became the unspoken measure of success. To remain healthy, solvent, and determined in the diggings was itself achievement. The gold rush, once imagined as swift transformation, revealed its slower reality. For most, it was not glory but persistence that defined the experience. The mining camps were overwhelmingly male in their earliest years. Letters written home often described rivers and gravel, but between the lines lay another reality: absence. Wives, mothers and sisters remained thousands of miles away, sustaining farms, shops and households in the east. Their labour preserved stability while men chased instability. For those left behind, daily life did not pause. Crops still required planting. Children required instruction. Debts required payment. A husband's departure often meant increased responsibility rather than relief. Some women managed entire farms alone. Others took in boarders to supplement income while awaiting remittances that did not always arrive. Communication travelled slowly. A letter sent from California could take months to reach New York or Ohio. Replies required equal time. News of illness, death, or disappointment was often outdated by the time it was received. The emotional strain of delay weighed heavily. Promises of quick return stretched into years. A small number of women did travel west, though the journey was no less demanding for them than for men. Overland trails were not designed for families. Yet some chose to accompany husbands, determined not to live in prolonged separation. Upon arrival, they encountered environments lacking privacy and infrastructure. Women who settled in mining regions quickly recognized economic opportunity beyond prospecting. Cooking, laundering, and boarding services were in constant demand. A boarding house, offering regular meals and relative order, could thrive. Female proprietors sometimes earned more stable income than miners who boarded with them. Social expectations travelled west alongside wagons and ships. Even in improvised camps, notions of respectability persisted. Communities often welcomed women not only for practical reasons but for symbolic ones. Their presence suggested permanence rather than temporary occupation. In San Francisco, the imbalance of gender ratios was striking. The city's population surged rapidly from roughly 200 residents in 1846 to over 35,000 by 1852. Yet women constituted a small minority. This imbalance influenced social behaviour. Saloons multiplied. By the early 1850s, more than 1,000 operated within the city. Drinking establishments offered diversion in a community where family life was sparse. Some women arrived as entrepreneurs rather than dependents. They opened hotels, restaurants, and retail shops. The high prices that burdened miners also created profit margins for those who supplied comfort. A clean bed, a proper meal, or mended clothing commanded premium. The Hangtown Fry, once ordered as celebratory indulgence, found its way onto menus beyond the original anecdote. Restaurants capitalized on the story, offering oysters and bacon to patrons seeking connection to legend. Food, like gold, became part of cultural identity. Family life in mining towns that evolved beyond temporary camps differed from early diggings. As surface gold diminished and more permanent settlements formed, some miners sent for families. Schools appeared. Churches were constructed. Domestic rhythms began to take root alongside economic ambition. Yet absence remained a defining feature for many. Children grew without fathers present. Some families received no further communication after initial letters. Illness, accident, or discouragement might prevent return. The uncertainty itself shaped memory. Cultural diversity influenced domestic adaptation. Chinese immigrant communities, often excluded from certain claims, formed tightly organized enclaves. They established their own businesses, temples, and mutual aid societies. Women within these communities were fewer still, but where families existed, traditions were maintained with deliberate care. Religious life expanded gradually. Ministers travelled between towns, offering services that reinforced moral frameworks. Congregations provided structure amid rapid change. Sermons sometimes addressed the tension between material pursuit and spiritual obligation. Clothing and daily routine adapted to environment. Durable denim trousers, supplied increasingly by merchants such as Levi Strauss, were adopted widely by miners, while women often wore practical dresses suited to travel and work rather than elaborate fashion of eastern cities. Fabric availability influenced style. Sewing skills became a valuable asset. Education emerged slowly in more stable towns. Parents who envisioned long-term residence demanded schooling for children. Teachers arrived, sometimes reluctantly, to frontier communities still defined by impermanence. The psychological experience of women during the gold rush varied widely. Some embraced opportunity, finding independence in business ownership. Others endured isolation in male-dominated settlements. For those remaining in eastern states, anxiety accompanied each delayed letter. They lived with hope, tempered by realism. Back in mining camps, the presence of women altered behaviour subtly. Men moderated conduct in mixed company. Establishments catering to families gained reputations for respectability. The culture of camps diversified beyond gambling and drink. Yet the majority of early miners continued to live in male-only environments. Without domestic structure, routines revolved around labour and commerce. The absence of family life intensified focus on immediate gain. Long-term planning seemed secondary to daily extraction. If you had waited months for a letter from someone you loved, unsure whether distance signaled opportunity or loss, how would you have measured success? Gold dust in a pouch could not replace conversation at a shared table. The gold rush was not solely a story of those who panned rivers. It was equally a story of those who sustained households elsewhere, who navigated uncertainty with patience rather than picks and shovels. As California's towns matured, the presence of families signaled transition from transient rush to settled society. Yet that transition unfolded unevenly. Some camps dissolved as deposits waned, leaving no trace of domestic aspiration. Others evolved into enduring communities. Absence shaped memory as much as presence shaped progress. The letters preserved from this era reveal affection, regret, ambition, and fatigue interwoven. They remind us that migration is never merely geographic, it is emotional as well. The rivers continue to yield gold in varying measure, but human relationships determined whether the pursuit felt worthwhile. As the mining camps multiplied and rivers grew crowded, the gold rush revealed another reality that could not be ignored. Gold was not the only thing being claimed. Land itself, valleys, forests, riverbanks, long inhabited by native Californian communities, was being occupied at unprecedented speed. Before 1848, California's indigenous population had already endured decades of disruption. Spanish missions had imposed forced labor and religious conversion. Mexican secularization altered control, but did not restore autonomy. Disease, introduced through colonial contact, had reduced numbers dramatically. Yet many native communities continued to live along rivers that would soon become mining centers. When thousands of prospectors arrived, they rarely considered prior claims. To miners, rivers represented opportunity. To native communities, they were sustenance and identity. Salmon runs, seasonal gathering grounds, and hunting territories were integral to survival. Mining operations diverted streams, muddied waters, and disrupted ecological balance. The political climate offered little protection. California lacked stable state institutions in the earliest rush years. Military authorities were overwhelmed. Informal mining codes prioritized those physically present and organized within camps. Indigenous communities, unfamiliar with American legal procedures and often excluded from decision-making assemblies, found themselves displaced without formal recourse. Violence emerged in scattered but devastating episodes. Some miners accused native people of theft or interference. Retaliation was swift and often disproportionate. Volunteer militias formed in certain regions, sometimes with tacit approval from local authorities. Raids and forced removals occurred. State policies later formalized aspects of exclusion, including laws that facilitated indentured servitude of native children. The consequences were profound. Entire villages were abandoned. Food sources diminished as river systems were altered. Starvation and disease intensified. The gold rush accelerated demographic collapse that had begun under earlier regimes. Foreign miners also faced hostility. Latin American miners, particularly those from Mexico and Chile, had arrived early and often possessed advanced techniques. Their success sometimes provoked resentment among American miners who felt entitled to priority. Tensions escalated into discriminatory legislation, including foreign miners' taxes imposed by California authorities. These taxes required non-American miners to pay monthly fees simply to operate claims. Chinese immigrants encountered similar hostility as their numbers increased in the early 1850s. Organized, disciplined, and often willing to rework abandoned claims, they became visible targets of suspicion. Violence and harassment occurred in various districts. Yet Chinese communities persisted, establishing networks of mutual support and commerce. The gold rush fostered a competitive environment where scarcity intensified prejudice. When surface deposits diminished, miners grew protective of claims. Rumors of theft or encroachment circulated quickly. Informal justice systems sometimes administered punishment without formal evidence. Meetings were convened, verdicts rendered, sentences enforced collectively. San Francisco, meanwhile, reflected both opportunity and instability. Its explosive growth from roughly 200 residents in 1846 to more than 35,000 by 1852 created strain on civic order. The nickname Instant City captured the pace of construction, but it also hinted at fragility. Infrastructure struggled to keep pace with population. Fires destroyed wooden districts repeatedly, requiring reconstruction. Law enforcement remained limited. Vigilance committees formed when citizens felt formal authority inadequate. These groups sought to combat crime, particularly theft and arson. Their actions sometimes restored order. At other times, they operated beyond legal boundaries. The absence of stable governance allowed improvisation to flourish for better and worse. In mining camps, disputes over claims occasionally escalated into confrontation. Boundaries marked with wooden stakes could be challenged. Water rights crucial for placer mining became contentious. Cooperation was necessary for stream diversion projects. Yet mistrust lingered. Economic disparity sharpened tensions. Merchants and suppliers often prospered more consistently than miners. A storekeeper who sold tools at high markup could accumulate wealth while prospectors struggled. Some miners resented this imbalance, though they depended on those same merchants for survival. Boomtown culture in San Francisco amplified volatility. More than 1,000 saloons operated by the early 1850s. Gambling halls multiplied. With gold dust serving as currency, wagers could be significant. Disputes arising from gambling losses sometimes turned violent. Alcohol lowered restraint in an already pressured environment. The harbour's abandoned ships symbolised both ambition and disorder. Crews who deserted for the mines left vessels without purpose. Some ships were repurposed into warehouses or boarding houses. Others decayed in place. As land was filled in to expand the city, several were buried beneath streets. The physical layering of ships beneath buildings mirrored the rapid layering of populations above. Political debates at the national level intersected with local realities. California's rapid growth compelled Congress to address its status. The question of whether it would enter the Union as a free state intensified sectional conflict between North and South. The Compromise of 1850 eventually admitted California as a free state, reshaping national balance. For individuals on the ground, these broader political negotiations felt distant yet consequential. Statehood promised formal legal systems, courts, and more structured governance. It also institutionalized certain discriminatory practices already emerging informally. Religious leaders in camps and cities attempted to address moral climate. Sermons cautioned against greed and violence. Churches organized charity for widows and the sick. Yet spiritual appeals could not reverse structural forces driving conflict. The environmental consequences of mining further strained relations. Hydraulic mining techniques, which would expand in subsequent years, eroded hillsides and filled rivers with sediment. Even in early placer stages, diversion of streams affected downstream communities. Native fisheries suffered. Agricultural lands were impacted by silt. If you had lived along a river for generations and witnessed its sudden transformation into crowded industrial site, how would you have interpreted that change? As progress or as loss? The gold rush was often celebrated as triumph of enterprise, yet for many it represented dispossession. The narrative of opportunity for some coexisted with narrative of displacement for others. Towns that flourished did so partly because others were emptied. Native villages declined as mining camps expanded. Foreign miners paid taxes that enriched state coffers but limited their own advancement. Vigilante justice maintained order in certain districts while undermining legal norms in others. California's transformation was not uniform or harmonious. It was layered with ambition, prejudice, adaptation, and resistance. Conflict did not define every interaction, but it remained persistent undercurrent. As years progressed, some communities stabilized, laws were codified, courts expanded, infrastructure improved. Yet the early period of the gold rush left marks that would not easily fade: demographic shifts, altered ecosystems, entrenched inequalities. The pursuit of gold revealed more than mineral wealth. It exposed how rapidly social contracts could be rewritten when resources were at stake. In the rush to claim opportunity, many failed to recognize what was being relinquished. By the early 1850s, a quiet realization began to circulate through California's growing settlements. The most reliable fortunes were not always found in riverbeds. They were found in storefronts, warehouses, transport routes, and financial ledgers. Mining, by its nature, was uncertain. Even diligent labor could yield little, but every miner required tools, clothing, food, and equipment. That steady demand created a parallel economy more predictable than prospecting itself. San Francisco stood at the center of this transformation. Its population explosion from roughly 200 residents in 1846 to more than 35,000 by 1852 had turned it into a bustling commercial hub. Entire districts had emerged with startling speed, earning it the nickname Instant City. Wharves extended into the bay to accommodate ships arriving from around the world. Warehouses lined the waterfront. Merchants who had once traded in hides and modest imports now managed inventories worth fortunes. The harbour remained crowded with abandoned vessels, their crews long gone to the mines. Some ships were converted into floating stores or hotels. Others were dismantled for lumber. Still others were buried beneath landfill as the city expanded outward. These ships, once symbols of transoceanic trade, became foundations for an urban economy driven by gold. Among the merchants who recognized opportunity early was a young immigrant from Bavaria named Levi Strauss. He arrived in San Francisco in 1853, initially intending to sell dry goods to miners. Observing the physical demands placed on clothing in the diggings, he adapted his business. Durable trousers made from sturdy fabric, eventually known as denim jeans, proved ideal for labourers who tore ordinary garments quickly. Reinforced seams and rivets increased longevity. Strauss did not mine for gold, yet he prospered because he understood that miners required durability as much as luck. His success illustrated broader pattern. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and suppliers of rope and timber built stable incomes. Transportation companies hauled goods from port to interior camps, charging high rates justified by difficult terrain. Banking services gradually emerged to safeguard gold dust and facilitate exchange. Financial institutions provided structure in a landscape where dust served as currency. Merchants in mining towns also flourished. General stores stocked tools, food, and imported luxuries. A miner might spend weeks extracting modest amounts of gold only to spend much of it on basic necessities at inflated prices. Storekeepers, though exposed to some risk, enjoyed far steadier returns. San Francisco's commercial growth fostered innovation. Insurance companies appeared to protect goods from fire, a constant threat in wooden districts built rapidly. Shipping firms coordinated supply routes. Newspapers expanded circulation, supported by advertising revenue from businesses seeking customers among newcomers. Boomtown culture contributed to commercial expansion. By the early 1850s, the city counted more than 1,000 saloons. These establishments purchased liquor in bulk from importers, stimulating additional trade. Gambling halls required furniture, lighting, and security services. Entertainment became industry. Speculation extended to land. Plots in San Francisco were bought and resold quickly as investors anticipated continued growth. Some fortunes were made simply by holding property during the city's explosive expansion. Others lost heavily when fires destroyed entire blocks, forcing reconstruction and altering property lines. The presence of abandoned ships in the harbour symbolized both disorder and adaptability. Rather than viewing them solely as relics, entrepreneurs incorporated them into commercial life. A grounded ship might become warehouse space. A hull partially filled in might serve as foundation for a building. Beneath modern streets, archaeologists would later uncover timbers from these vessels, silent testimony to improvisation. Financial discipline distinguished many successful merchants from unsuccessful miners. Keeping accurate accounts, managing supply chains, and negotiating contracts required skills not dependent on luck. In this sense, the gold rush rewarded organization as much as daring. As commerce expanded, California's political status demanded resolution. The Compromise of 1850 admitted California as a free state, providing formal state government and representation in Congress. Statehood brought courts, taxation systems, and more predictable legal frameworks. Business interests benefited from clearer property laws and contract enforcement. Merchants often supported stronger governance. Stability facilitated trade. Vigilance committees that had formed in earlier years gradually gave way to more institutionalized law enforcement. Banks required reliable legal systems to protect deposits. The shift from individual prospecting toward organized enterprise also reflected technological change. As surface gold deposits diminished, larger operations became necessary. Hydraulic mining, introduced in the early 1850s, required significant capital investment. Companies formed to finance equipment and labor. Mining transitioned from solitary effort to corporate enterprise. This transformation altered social hierarchy. Independent miners found themselves competing with well-funded operations capable of moving entire hillsides. Some adapted by selling claims to companies and seeking employment within structured operations. Others left mining altogether to pursue alternative livelihoods. Urban culture matured alongside commerce. Theaters opened in San Francisco. Restaurants diversified menus. The Hangtown Fry, once a miner's celebratory indulgence, became menu staple in certain establishments. Culinary culture reflected both scarcity and abundance. Levi Strauss's durable trousers spread beyond mining camps. As railroads expanded and agricultural development accelerated, denim became standard attire for laborers across the American West. A garment designed for gravel and river water entered broader cultural circulation. The first mechanical slot machines would later appear in San Francisco, aligning with the city's long-standing appetite for risk and entertainment. Though developed decades after the initial rush, they grew from culture shaped during those formative years where chance, speculation, and innovation intertwined. Economic diversification gradually reduced dependence on gold extraction alone. Agriculture expanded in fertile valleys, wheat production increased, ranching regained stability under new market conditions. The port of San Francisco became central to Pacific trade. For individuals who had arrived as miners, the transition could be disorienting. The dream of striking it rich gave way to recognition that consistent income lay elsewhere. Some embraced this shift readily. Others clung to claims even as returns declined. If you had journeyed thousands of miles seeking gold, how would you have felt upon realizing that the surest fortune belonged to those who sold shovels rather than used them? The gold rush, in time, became less about riverbeds and more about infrastructure. It built banks, shipping networks, retail industries, and manufacturing ventures. It reshaped not only California's economy but the nation's. The glitter in the water had sparked movement, but it was the steady work of merchants, financiers, and suppliers that sustained transformation. San Francisco did not grow gradually, it erupted. In 1846, the settlement that would become the city counted roughly 200 residents. A few wooden structures lined the shoreline. The harbour welcomed occasional trading vessels. Muddy streets connected modest homes and small stores. There was little to suggest that within 6 years the population would surge beyond 35,000. Yet by 1852 that was precisely the case. The transformation was so rapid that observers struggled to describe it. Entire streets seemed to appear between one arrival and the next. Canvas tents gave way to wooden buildings, which in turn were replaced by brick structures after repeated fires destroyed earlier construction. The pace earned the city a nickname, Instant City. It captured both admiration and disbelief. Ships arrived daily through the Golden Gate Strait. That narrow entrance, once named decades earlier for its resemblance to a gateway, now it felt literal. Thousands of hopeful prospectors passed beneath its headlands, seeing it as threshold to prosperity. The strait did not create the rush, but it framed it, channeling global ambition into one harbour. The harbour itself became an extraordinary spectacle. Crews abandoned vessels almost as soon as anchors dropped. Sailors who had signed contracts for months-long voyages walked off ships in search of gold. Some captains found themselves unable to assemble enough crew to depart again. Hundreds of ships were left idle. Over time, many rotted at anchor. Others were hauled ashore and repurposed into warehouses, hotels, or even jails. Some were gradually buried beneath landfill as the shoreline expanded outward. Beneath what would later become the financial district lie remnants of hulls that once crossed oceans. The physical layering of ships beneath streets symbolized the city's improvisation. Nothing was wasted if it could serve immediate need. Lumber from dismantled vessels framed new buildings. Canvas became roofing. Every material had value. Inflation in the city matched inflation in the camps. Housing was scarce, rents soared. Boarding houses charged high rates for shared rooms. Food prices fluctuated depending on supply shipments. A meal that cost modest sum in New York might cost several times that amount in San Francisco. Commerce expanded to meet demand. Merchants opened shops selling tools, clothing, and imported goods. Restaurants served miners on brief visits from interior camps. The Hangtown Fry, originally born of a miner's celebratory extravagance, appeared on menus as culinary nod to the rush itself. Saloons multiplied rapidly. By the early 1850s, more than 1,000 operated within city limits. They ranged from crude establishments with rough wooden counters to elaborate halls with mirrors and chandeliers imported from Europe. Gold dust served as currency for drinks and wagers. The city acquired reputation for noise and excess. Gambling thrived. Games of chance attracted those unwilling to endure months of labour for uncertain return. The appetite for risk extended beyond mining claims to card tables and roulette wheels. Later in the century, the first mechanical slot machines would be invented in San Francisco, reflecting enduring fascination with fortune determined by chance. The cultural foundation for such invention was laid during these early boom years. Fire became a constant threat. Buildings constructed quickly from dry lumber were vulnerable. Several devastating fires swept through San Francisco in the early 1850s, destroying blocks at a time. Yet reconstruction was swift. Investors and labourers rebuilt almost immediately, often with improved materials. Brick replaced wood where possible. The city learned resilience through repetition. Law struggled to keep pace. Formal police forces were limited in early years. Crime, particularly theft and arson, provoked concern among residents who feared instability might undermine commercial growth. Vigilance committees formed, composed of citizens determined to impose order where they perceived governmental weakness. These committees conducted investigations, trials, and punishments. Their methods were controversial but reflected urgency felt by a rapidly expanding population. Civic institutions developed unevenly. Churches were built as congregations formed. Newspapers multiplied, documenting daily events and advertising services. Theatres opened, offering entertainment beyond saloons. Cultural life matured alongside commerce. The demographic composition of San Francisco was diverse. Americans from eastern states mingled with immigrants from Europe, Latin America, and Asia. Languages overlapped in marketplaces. Tension accompanied diversity, but so did exchange. Imported goods arrived from China and South America. Ships departing San Francisco carried not only gold, but agricultural products and manufactured items. The city's growth influenced interior regions. It served as supply hub for mining camps, financial center for transactions, and political stage for debates about governance. When California achieved statehood in 1850, San Francisco quickly assumed prominence as commercial capital. Infrastructure improved gradually. Wharves were extended, roads connecting port to interior were maintained more systematically. Stagecoach lines carried passengers and mail. Telegraph lines would later accelerate communication, though in early years news still travelled by ship or horseback. Urban ambition began to rival mining ambition. Some individuals who had arrived intending to prospect chose instead to invest in property or businesses within the city. Land speculation proved lucrative for those who anticipated growth correctly. Entire neighbourhoods emerged where none had existed months before. The presence of abandoned ships continued to fascinate observers. Visitors walked past hulls embedded in streets, reminders of how quickly maritime order had yielded to terrestrial opportunity. Archaeological discoveries in later centuries would confirm that dozens of vessels remained beneath layers of development. Economic inequality became visible. Wealth accumulated in mercantile houses and banks, while many labourers struggled with high living costs. Yet, opportunity remained tangible enough to sustain optimism. Employment in construction, transport, and retail expanded. Religious leaders and civic reformers attempted to temper excess. They warned against moral decline in a city where gold dust could disappear across a gambling table in minutes. Yet the city's character remained energetic and restless. If you had arrived in San Francisco in 1846 and returned 6 years later, you might scarcely recognize it. The scale of change defied gradual explanation. Population growth from 200 to more than 35,000 reshaped every aspect of daily life. The Golden Gate continued to frame arrivals, but now ships passed through toward a skyline of masts, scaffolding, and smoke. The harbour no longer suggested frontier isolation. It suggested global connection. San Francisco had become more than gateway to the mines. It had become symbol of transformation itself, evidence that ambition, when concentrated, could remake geography. Yet even as the city thrived, many mining towns inland were already approaching decline. Prosperity in one place did not guarantee permanence in another. Growth can be as fleeting as gold in a pan. What seemed instant could also prove fragile. The rapid expansion of California exposed a problem that could not be solved by ambition alone. Who, exactly, was in charge? In the earliest months of the gold rush, formal governance lagged behind population growth. Military authority administered the territory after the Mexican-American War, but it lacked personnel to supervise thousands scattered along rivers and hillsides. Mining camps developed their own rules, often written hastily and enforced by consensus. These informal codes reflected American frontier traditions. At mass meetings, miners voted on claim sizes, boundaries, and procedures for dispute resolution. If a miner left his claim unattended beyond a specified period, others could declare it abandoned. Water rights were negotiated locally. Decisions carried weight because they were collectively agreed upon, not because they were backed by institutional power. This system worked unevenly. In smaller camps where participants knew one another, consensus was easier. In larger settlements with transient populations, enforcement grew complicated. Disputes sometimes escalated beyond words. Physical confrontation was not uncommon, particularly when rumours of rich deposits intensified competition. The absence of clear territorial courts created ambiguity. Contracts signed in eastern states sometimes lacked recognition. Land titles dating to Mexican grants required validation under American law. Californios who had held property for decades found themselves navigating unfamiliar legal frameworks. Statehood in 1850 brought formal government to California. A constitution was drafted in Monterey. The new state entered the Union as free territory under the Compromise of 1850. With statehood came elected officials, established courts, and codified laws. Yet implementation required time. Infrastructure had to be built. Judges had to travel long distances to hear cases. Meanwhile, cities such as San Francisco faced immediate challenges. Crime accompanied rapid growth. Theft of gold dust, arson in crowded districts, and organized gambling rings raised alarm among business leaders who feared instability might discourage investment. In response, vigilance committees formed in San Francisco during the early 1850s. These citizen-led groups claimed to restore order where formal law enforcement proved insufficient. They conducted investigations, held trials, and in some cases carried out executions. Supporters argued that decisive action preserved civic stability. Critics questioned legality and due process. The tension between informal justice and institutional authority reflected broader transition from frontier improvisation to structured governance. California's explosive population growth from 200 residents in 1846 to more than 35,000 by 1,852 inches. San Francisco alone had outpaced administrative planning. Mining districts also experimented with local courts. Judges were sometimes elected by miners. Proceedings were conducted outdoors or in makeshift halls. Evidence could be informal, yet these courts often resolved disputes efficiently, reinforcing community cohesion. Discrimination entered legal frameworks as well. Foreign miners' taxes targeted non-American prospectors, requiring monthly payments to continue operations. Chinese miners faced additional restrictions. Laws regarding testimony sometimes barred certain racial groups from testifying against white defendants, limiting legal recourse for victims of violence. Native Californians encountered even harsher conditions. State legislation permitted indenture of native children and supported militia campaigns against indigenous communities. Legal structures often legitimized displacement already underway. Economic regulation expanded gradually. As hydraulic mining developed in the 1850s, conflicts over water usage intensified. Farmers downstream objected to sediment that clogged fields and rivers. Lawsuits would later emerge challenging mining practices, signaling growing awareness of environmental impact. Banking institutions provided greater financial stability. Gold dust was deposited, converted into coin, and shipped east. Insurance firms mitigated risk for merchants vulnerable to fire. Contracts gained enforceability under formal courts. Transportation infrastructure also benefited from governance. Roads were surveyed and improved. Stagecoach companies operated on more predictable schedules. Telegraph lines, introduced later in the decade, accelerated communication between California and the rest of the nation. The legal environment shaped social expectations. Citizens demanded protection for property. Merchants advocated for regulations that safeguarded trade. Reformers sought moral legislation addressing gambling and vice. Yet governance remained imperfect. Corruption appeared in certain offices. Political rivalries divided communities. California's rapid integration into national politics intensified debates over slavery and sectional balance. For miners in remote camps, the presence of state government felt distant. They continued relying on local codes for day-to-day regulation. But gradually, institutional authority reached farther inland. Sheriffs, judges, and tax collectors appeared, where once only meeting assemblies existed. Urban culture matured alongside legal frameworks. Schools were established with public funding. Libraries formed. Municipal governments addressed sanitation and street maintenance. Fire departments organized more systematically to prevent recurrent devastation. The shift from informal to formal governance did not erase frontier character entirely. Vigilance committees re-emerged periodically when citizens perceived official institutions as ineffective. The tension between self-governance and state authority persisted as a defining feature of California's early years. If you had lived in a camp where neighbors collectively decided justice, would you have welcomed the arrival of distant judges or feared loss of autonomy? The gold rush accelerated not only economic development but political evolution. California moved rapidly from contested territory to structured state, propelled by population growth and financial importance. Law, like gold, was extracted and refined through effort. It required negotiation, compromise, and adaptation. The improvisations of early camps gave way to constitutions and statutes, yet traces of that improvisational spirit remained embedded in civic culture. As the first intensity of the rush softened into routine, a quieter reckoning began. The riverbank still filled each morning, tools still struck gravel, and merchants still counted profits in San Francisco. Yet something in the mood of the population had shifted. The early certainty that gold would quickly change every life had given way to a more complicated understanding. Religious faith, which many miners had carried west from small towns and immigrant villages, resurfaced in new forms. Ministers travelled between camps, sometimes preaching beneath open sky, sometimes in newly built wooden churches in growing towns. Sermons addressed practical matters, honesty in trade, fairness in disputes, but also spoke to deeper unease. Wealth pursued at any cost raised moral questions. Some miners interpreted their success, or lack of it, through religious lens. A fruitful claim could be seen as providence. A barren stretch of river might be explained as test of perseverance. Yet prolonged disappointment strained such explanations. Letters home increasingly revealed doubt not necessarily of faith, but of expectation. Hope had sustained the journey west. It had endured through disease on the trail and exhaustion in the diggings. But as months became years, many faced the realization that they might never return home wealthy. Some had earned enough to live modestly. Few had secured fortunes beyond imagination. Psychological fatigue appeared quietly. Men who had once moved eagerly from one roomer to another began to settle. They rented rooms rather than sleeping in tents. They invested in small businesses rather than chasing distant reports of new strikes. The search for stability replaced the search for sudden transformation. San Francisco, now firmly established as commercial center, mirrored this transition. Though still energetic and often disorderly, it developed institutions that signaled permanence: banks, theatres, newspapers, churches. Its population, having surged from 200 residents in 1846 to more than 35,000 by 1852, continued to grow, but growth was less chaotic than in earliest years. Brick buildings replaced temporary wooden structures in many districts, reducing vulnerability to fire. Boomtown culture persisted. More than 1,000 saloons operated within the city during the height of expansion. Gambling remained central to social life, yet alongside vice, civic organizations flourished. Reform movements sought to regulate excess. Educational institutions expanded. The economic structure of the gold rush had clarified. Merchants, transporters, and financiers enjoyed more predictable prosperity than miners. Levi Strauss's durable denim trousers had become common attire, emblem of practical adaptation. Clothing designed for survival in the diggings now symbolized identity of the West itself. In mining regions, technological change altered labor patterns. Hydraulic mining required capital investment beyond reach of individual prospectors. Companies formed to finance equipment capable of directing powerful streams of water against hillsides. Independent miners often found themselves working as wage laborers for larger enterprises. The individualistic dream of striking it rich with a pan and shovel became less attainable. For some, this shift brought relief. Wage labour provided steady income, even if modest. For others, it signalled loss of autonomy. The freedom to choose one's claim and manage one's hours diminished within corporate structures. Disillusionment did not always manifest as bitterness. It often appeared as recalibration. Expectations adjusted to reality. A miner who once imagined returning east as wealthy landowner might now envision modest farm in California. The dream contracted but did not disappear. Ghost towns began to emerge quietly across the landscape. Camps that had flourished during peak extraction emptied when deposits thinned. Tents were dismantled. Cabins were abandoned. Tools were left behind. Wind and weather reclaimed spaces once crowded with voices. These towns stood as reminders that opportunity tied to specific resources can vanish quickly. Yet even abandonment carried meaning. The population did not simply evaporate, it redistributed. Many former miners settled in valleys where agriculture proved profitable. Others moved to San Francisco or Sacramento to seek employment in commerce or government. The human energy unleashed by the rush did not disappear, it transformed. Religious communities in more stable towns offered continuity. Churches became centers for social gathering beyond economic activity. Ministers addressed themes of patience, humility, and gratitude virtues, perhaps less celebrated in early rush years. Cultural identity matured. The Hangtown Fry, once anecdote of sudden extravagance, became symbol of regional pride. Stories of early days were retold in newspapers and memoirs. Narratives emphasized courage and perseverance more than easy wealth. National politics continued to intersect with California's development. As Free State admitted under the Compromise of 1850, California influenced sectional balance in Congress. Its senators and representatives participated in debates shaping the nation's path toward civil war. The gold rush had accelerated its integration into federal politics. For individuals reflecting on their journey west, memory became selective. The hardships of the trail, the price of eggs sold for $1 each, the sight of abandoned ships in San Francisco's harbor, these details formed part of personal mythology. Some recounted them with humor, others with caution. If you had endured years of labor for modest return, would you view the experience as failure or as education? The gold rush exposed tension between ambition and contentment. It demonstrated that wealth measured solely in gold dust could prove elusive, but wealth measured in resilience and adaptation might endure. San Francisco continued to innovate. The appetite for risk that had driven prospectors west fueled commercial experimentation. Financial institutions strengthened. Trade networks expanded into Pacific markets. The Golden Gate, once passage to uncertain opportunity, now framed entrance to established metropolis. In mining regions, environmental change became more visible. Hills scarred by hydraulic mining testified to industrial-scale extraction. Farmers downstream protested sediment that damaged crops. Legal battles would later emerge over environmental impact, signaling growing awareness of consequences. Disillusionment did not extinguish identity. Rather, it deepened it. The Gold Rush generation had confronted uncertainty directly. They had learned that fortune required more than rumor. Hope had carried them west. Reality had reshaped hope into experience. By the mid-1850s, the character of mining in California had changed so thoroughly that a visitor returning after several years might struggle to recognize the process. The solitary figure kneeling in a river with a pan had not disappeared entirely, but he was no longer central. Gold extraction had become increasingly industrial. Hydraulic mining marked the most dramatic shift. Engineers developed systems that used high-pressure water jets to erode entire hillsides. Water was diverted through miles of wooden flumes and iron pipes, then released through nozzles powerful enough to dislodge tons of earth in minutes. Gravel and sediment washed into sluice boxes where gold particles settled. This method required capital investment far beyond the reach of independent miners. Companies formed to pool resources. Shares were sold. Investors in San Francisco financed operations in remote foothills. Mining became corporate enterprise rather than individual gamble. The scale of alteration to the landscape was unprecedented. Hillsides collapsed under sustained water pressure. Forests were cleared to build flumes and provide lumber. Rivers, once clear enough to reflect sky and pine, turned murky with sediment. Downstream agricultural communities noticed change immediately. Silt clogged irrigation channels. Flood risk increased as riverbeds rose. Legal disputes followed. Farmers filed lawsuits, arguing that hydraulic debris damaged their property. Mining companies defended operations as essential to state prosperity. Courts eventually intervened, limiting certain practices in later decades. But during the height of expansion, economic momentum favored industrial mining. For laborers, the shift meant employment rather than ownership. Some former independent miners became wage workers operating hydraulic equipment. Work was dangerous. Collapsing embankments and unstable terrain posed risk, yet wages provided stability compared to uncertain returns of placer mining. Technological innovation extended beyond hydraulic methods. Quartz mining, extracting gold embedded in rock, required crushing mills and chemical processes. Stamp mills pounded ore into fine particles before treatment. These operations demanded significant infrastructure and skilled management. The industrialization of mining altered community structure. Camps, organized around corporate sites, were more stable than earlier tent settlements. Housing for workers was sometimes provided by companies. Schedules replaced self-directed labor. Hierarchies emerged within operations: managers, engineers, laborers. San Francisco benefited directly from this transition. As financial center, it coordinated investment and distribution. Banks expanded services. Insurance firms covered industrial equipment. The city's growth, already extraordinary, continued as commercial networks strengthened. Levi Strauss's durable denim trousers, originally designed for individual miners, adapted easily to industrial settings. Reinforced clothing suited workers operating heavy machinery. What began as response to river labor now aligned with corporate mining's demands. Transportation infrastructure improved in response to industrial needs. Roads capable of supporting heavy wagons were constructed. Railroads began extending into California in the 1860s, further integrating the state into national economy. Though the Transcontinental Railroad lay beyond the earliest gold rush years, its eventual completion in 1869 was rooted partly in economic expansion initiated by gold. Environmental consequences accumulated visibly. Entire valleys bore scars of hydraulic erosion. Tailings waste gravel formed unnatural mounds. Rivers carried sediment far downstream, affecting navigation and agriculture. The environmental legacy would endure long after gold production declined. Social hierarchies sharpened. Investors in San Francisco and eastern cities accumulated wealth through dividends. Laborers earned wages but rarely achieved fortunes. The dream of sudden individual enrichment receded further into memory. Ghost towns multiplied as industrial operations concentrated in specific regions. Smaller camps that had depended on surface deposits emptied. Wooden structures collapsed under weather. Tools rusted. Paths disappeared into brush. These abandoned settlements became physical reminders that opportunity tied to resource extraction could be temporary. Yet California's broader economy diversified. Agriculture expanded dramatically in fertile Central Valley. Wheat exports grew. Cattle ranching regained prominence. Urban manufacturing developed gradually. The gold rush had served as catalyst rather than endpoint. Cultural identity evolved alongside economic transformation. The narrative of the lone prospector endured in popular imagination, even as reality shifted toward corporate enterprise. Newspapers romanticized early days. Memoirs emphasized adventure and discovery. The Golden Gate remained symbolic entrance to prosperity, though prosperity now meant commercial and industrial growth as much as gold dust. Ships arriving carried machinery as well as migrants. The harbour, once cluttered with abandoned vessels, now hosted organized maritime trade. The industrial phase of mining also intensified conflict over land use. Indigenous communities, already displaced, faced further marginalization as landscapes were reshaped. Chinese laborers, often employed in mining and railroad construction, continued to encounter discrimination and violence. Economic expansion did not eliminate prejudice. For individuals who had begun their California journey as hopeful 49ers, this new era required adjustment. Some invested in mining companies, shifting from labor to management. Others transitioned into agriculture or commerce. Many accepted that their personal transformation would not match early fantasies. If you had once believed that fortune lay waiting in untouched riverbeds, how would you interpret hillsides blasted apart by machines? As progress or as evidence that opportunity had changed shape? Industrial mining represented maturity of the gold rush economy. It demonstrated capacity to mobilize capital and technology rapidly. It also revealed costs, environmental, social, and psychological. California was no longer frontier experiment. It was integrated state with complex economy and growing influence. The rush had initiated transformation. Industrialization consolidated it. Gold still flowed from Earth, but it did so through networks of investment and machinery rather than solitary pans. The dream persisted, though its form had evolved. By the time industrial mining had taken hold, California was no longer simply a remote destination for fortune seekers. It had become a political force within the United States, its rapid growth altering the balance of power in ways few had predicted when gold first shimmered in the American River. The discovery had accelerated statehood with unusual speed. Normally, territories moved gradually toward admission, building population and infrastructure over years. California compressed that timeline. Within 2 years of the major rush of 1849, it had drafted a constitution and entered the Union as a free state in 1850 under the Compromise of 1850. This decision carried national weight. The question of whether new territories would permit slavery was central to sectional tensions dividing North and South. California's admission as a free state shifted the delicate balance in Congress. Southern leaders worried about diminishing influence. Northern politicians recognized strategic advantage. The gold rush had not been designed to influence slavery debates, yet it did so decisively. For Californians on the ground, national politics felt distant but consequential. Statehood meant representation in Congress, federal funding, and formal legal systems. It meant judges with recognized authority rather than solely local assemblies. It meant clearer land title processes, though these were often complex and prolonged. California's families who had held ranchos under Spanish and Mexican rule faced particular challenges. The Land Act of 1851 required them to prove ownership before U.S. land commissions. Legal fees mounted. Proceedings lasted years. Many lost portions of property while navigating unfamiliar American legal standards. The gold rush did not invent these pressures, but it intensified them by raising land values dramatically. Economic power consolidated in San Francisco, whose explosive growth from roughly 200 residents in 1846 to more than 35,000 by 1852 had positioned it as financial center. Banks headquartered there managed gold shipments and financed industrial mining. Insurance firms underwrote maritime trade. Political influence followed economic weight. The Golden Gate Strait, once geographic curiosity, had become artery of commerce. Ships entering the harbour carried machinery, manufactured goods, and immigrants. Ships departing carried gold, agricultural products, and timber. California's economy was no longer isolated. It was integrated into Pacific and national trade networks. Legislative priorities reflected this integration. Infrastructure projects received attention: roads, ports, and eventually railroads. The idea of a transcontinental railroad gained urgency in part because California's gold made connection profitable. Though construction would not begin until the 1860s, political momentum had roots in the prosperity unleashed by gold. State government also codified practices that had begun informally. Foreign miners' taxes were formalized, disproportionately targeting Latin American and Chinese miners. Laws governing testimony and citizenship restricted rights of non-white residents. Political participation was unevenly distributed. Religious and civic organizations expanded influence within more structured environment. Churches constructed permanent buildings. Schools received public funding. Newspapers developed partisan identities, shaping public debate. Urban reform movements emerged in San Francisco. Vigilance committees that had once operated outside formal structures evolved or dissolved as official law enforcement strengthened. Municipal government addressed fire prevention and sanitation more systematically. Industrial mining companies exerted political influence. They lobbied for favorable water rights and resisted regulation of hydraulic debris. Farmers downstream organized in response, leading to legal conflicts that foreshadowed environmental regulation debates. For individuals who had journeyed west in search of gold, the political transformation of California might have seemed secondary to personal outcomes, yet their presence made it possible. Without massive migration, statehood would have been delayed. Without economic growth, national attention might have shifted elsewhere. Cultural identity also evolved. California began to see itself not merely as mining frontier, but as distinctive region within Union. Agricultural fairs showcased produce. Universities would eventually be founded. The idea of California as place of reinvention persisted, though grounded now in broader economy rather than solely in mineral extraction. The industrial workforce diversified further during the Civil War era. While the war did not occur on California soil, its economic and political implications reached westward. Gold shipments supported Union finances. California's status as free state reinforced federal alignment. Meanwhile, ghost towns multiplied in interior regions where deposits were exhausted. Wooden buildings weathered, mines flooded or were abandoned. The contrast between thriving San Francisco and empty camps illustrated uneven legacy of the rush. If you had arrived as hopeful prospector and now watched legislators debate water rights in Sacramento, would you recognize the connection between your first pan of gravel and these political chambers? Gold had done more than enrich individuals. It had propelled a territory into statehood, altered congressional balance, stimulated infrastructure development, and influenced national strategy. Yet power, once gained, carried responsibility. Environmental damage from hydraulic mining demanded regulation. Discriminatory laws faced eventual challenge. Economic growth required governance to remain sustainable. California's transformation from remote province to influential state occurred within a decade, a pace as startling as San Francisco's rise from 200 residents to tens of thousands. As the most fevered years of the gold rush receded, a quieter question settled over California. Who would remain? Not everyone returned east. Not everyone chased the next rumor of distant strike. Many who had arrived with temporary plans found themselves rooted in soil they had once viewed only as stepping stone. The rivers that first promised gold now bordered farms. The hills once blasted by hydraulic mining overlooked towns with schools and churches. For former miners, transition required adjustment of identity. A man who had once measured his success in ounces of gold dust might now measure it in acres planted or goods sold. Some purchased land in fertile valleys, recognizing that agriculture offered steadier income than uncertain claims. Wheat fields expanded across the Central Valley. Ranching revived under new market conditions. Cattle and sheep once again shaped the landscape. San Francisco continued to serve as commercial heart. Its rapid expansion from roughly 200 residents in 1846 to over 35,000 by 1852 had laid foundation for enduring metropolis. Now its growth stabilized into structured neighborhoods. Brick buildings replaced many earlier wooden constructions destroyed by fire. Streets were graded. Municipal services improved. The abandoned ships once visible in the harbor became less prominent as shoreline expanded. Some remained buried beneath streets, hidden reminders of the city's improvisational origins. Others were dismantled long ago. Maritime trade shifted from chaotic influx to organized schedules. Merchants who had prospered during peak rush years diversified investments. Banks expanded lending beyond mining enterprises into agriculture and manufacturing. Insurance firms underwrote shipping and property with greater sophistication. Entrepreneurs recognized that California's future extended beyond gold. Former miners who had adopted wage labor in industrial mining sometimes sought different paths. Railroad construction in the 1860s offered employment. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, connected California directly to eastern markets. Many laborers, Chinese immigrants, among them played central roles in its construction. The line symbolized permanent integration into national economy. Communities matured culturally as well as economically. Schools multiplied. Newspapers chronicled local events rather than solely mining reports. Civic celebrations marked statehood anniversaries. Churches established denominational networks across towns. Family life expanded in regions once dominated by transient camps. Women who had remained in eastern states sometimes joined husbands permanently. Children grew up knowing California not as frontier experiment but as home. Education and community institutions provided continuity. Ghost towns remained scattered across hillsides, their empty structures silent witnesses to earlier ambition. Some were dismantled for materials, others stood intact for years before weather reduced them to foundations. They reminded residents that opportunity can be localized and temporary. Industrial mining operations continued in certain districts, though legal challenges to hydraulic practices grew stronger. Environmental awareness increased as farmers downstream sought protection from sediment. Court decisions in later decades would restrict debris dumping, signaling shift toward regulated resource use. Levi Strauss's durable denim trousers, once simple solution to mining wear, became standard attire for laborers across industries, railroad workers, farmers, mechanics. A practical garment had transcended its original purpose, woven into broader American identity. San Francisco's appetite for innovation persisted. Gambling halls evolved. The first mechanical slot machines, invented in the city later in the 19th century, reflected enduring fascination with chance. The gold rush mentality risk, rewarded by luck or calculation, had embedded itself in urban culture. Economic inequality remained visible. Wealth concentrated in commercial and financial sectors. Labourers earned wages sufficient for subsistence but rarely amassed fortunes, yet social mobility was not absent. Some who had arrived with little built modest prosperity through persistence and adaptation. Religious life stabilized into organized congregations. Ministers addressed themes of stewardship and responsibility, acknowledging that prosperity required ethical management. Community charities assisted widows and orphans, some left by mining accidents or disease. Political influence of California continued to expand nationally. Senators and representatives shaped debates beyond mining. The state's agricultural output and port trade increased strategic importance. For individuals reflecting on their journey, memory softened certain edges. The price of eggs that once reached $1 apiece became anecdote illustrating scarcity. The sight of San Francisco's harbor crowded with abandoned ships became emblem of sudden change. Stories of Hangtown Fry were told with humor rather than awe. If you had arrived expecting to stay a year and found yourself raising children in the same valleys decades later, how would you interpret that transformation? As compromise or as fulfillment of deeper intention? The gold rush generation had learned that opportunity rarely conformed to initial vision, yet many discovered new forms of success not imagined at outset. California's landscape bore scars of extraction, but it also bore orchards, rail lines, and schools. The state was no longer experiment. It was established society shaped by movement. Those who stayed became architects of permanence. When the first flakes of gold were lifted from the American river, few paused to consider what the land itself would endure. The rivers seemed vast, the hills unmovable, the forests endless. Yet within a decade, entire valleys bore visible marks of extraction. Placer mining had altered riverbanks through digging and diversion, but hydraulic mining reshaped hillsides on an industrial scale. High-pressure water cannons blasted earth away, washing sediment into sluices below. The immediate effect was efficient gold recovery. The long-term effect was profound environmental disruption. Sediment travelled downstream, settling in agricultural fields and river channels. Farmers in the Sacramento Valley watched fertile soil buried beneath debris. Navigation routes became clogged. Flooding increased as riverbeds rose. What had begun as localized mining operation extended its impact across regions. Legal battles emerged between mining companies and agricultural interests. Farmers argued that hydraulic debris damaged crops and property. Mining operators countered that gold production benefited the entire state economy. The tension highlighted broader question: how should resource extraction be balanced against environmental stability? Eventually, court decisions would restrict hydraulic mining, recognizing the scale of damage. But during the peak years, economic momentum often overpowered environmental caution. Forests suffered as well. Timber was cut extensively for flumes, sluices, and building materials. Mining camps consumed wood for heating and cooking. Hillsides, once densely wooded, appeared stripped. Wildlife habitats shifted under pressure of human activity. Ghost towns dotted landscapes where deposits were exhausted. In some regions, entire settlements were abandoned within months of declining returns. Structures decayed slowly. Wind moved through empty doorways. Tools rusted where they had been left. These towns became quiet testimony to the temporary nature of mineral wealth. San Francisco, meanwhile, continued expanding its urban footprint. Land reclamation projects buried some of the abandoned ships that had once cluttered the harbour. Beneath modern streets lay wooden hulls from vessels deserted during the height of migration. The layering of city over ship, over bay, illustrated how rapidly environment could be repurposed. Agriculture gained prominence as mining declined in certain districts. The Central Valley's fertile soil supported wheat production on large scale. Irrigation systems improved, ranching expanded. The economic identity of California diversified, reducing dependence on gold alone. Yet environmental scars remained visible. Hills gouged by hydraulic monitors did not easily return to original contours. Rivers carried sediment long after operations ceased. Ecological recovery required decades, sometimes longer. Native Californian communities, already devastated by displacement and violence during early rush years, faced further marginalization as land was permanently altered. Access to traditional fishing and hunting grounds diminished. Demographic decline accelerated under pressure of disease and conflict. Chinese immigrant laborers, many of whom had contributed significantly to mining and railroad construction, encountered increasing hostility as economic conditions shifted. Anti-Chinese sentiment intensified in later decades, culminating in exclusionary legislation. The inclusive promise implied by early rush years narrowed over time. Urban development brought its own environmental challenges. San Francisco's rapid population growth from 200 residents in 1846 to more than 35,000 by 1852 had necessitated hasty construction. As the city matured, infrastructure projects improved sanitation and water supply, yet urban density introduced pollution and waste management issues. Cultural memory of the gold rush often emphasized courage and opportunity, but environmental historians later examined its ecological costs. The hills and rivers bore evidence that resource extraction rarely leaves landscape unchanged. If you had stood on a hillside once forested and watched water cannons reduce it to slurry, would you have imagined how long those scars would last? The tension between progress and preservation did not end with the gold rush. It became a recurring theme in California's history, visible in debates over water rights, land development, and environmental regulation in subsequent generations. Yet, even amid damage, resilience appeared. Farmers reclaimed silted land. Communities rebuilt after fires and floods. Forests regrew in certain districts. Human and natural systems adapted, though not without loss. California's identity incorporated both its prosperity and its environmental challenges. The same ambition that drove miners to rivers would later drive engineers to manage water systems, farmers to cultivate orchards, and conservationists to protect landscapes. The gold rush had initiated profound transformation. Its environmental legacy forced reconsideration of how wealth was pursued and at what cost. The land remembered even when people forgot. Hills, scarred by hydraulic mining, stood as monuments not only to technological innovation, but to the complexity of progress. In the decades that followed the first rush to the rivers, memory began its careful work. The generation that had crossed plains, rounded Cape Horn, or struggled through Panama grew older. Their stories shifted in tone. What had once felt urgent and uncertain became material for reflection. The gold rush entered popular imagination as legend. Illustrations depicted solitary prospectors discovering gleaming nuggets beneath clear water. Songs and stage plays dramatized adventure and sudden wealth. Memoirs emphasized daring over fatigue. The image of the 49er, hat tilted against sun and pan in hand, became shorthand for boldness. Yet those who had lived through it understood that the legend was incomplete. They remembered the price of eggs reaching $1 apiece in remote camps, forcing difficult choices between nourishment and trade. They remembered the harbour of San Francisco crowded with abandoned ships, their crews vanished inland, hulls later buried beneath expanding streets. They remembered the city's transformation from roughly 200 residents in 1846 to more than 35,000 by 1852, rising so quickly that it earned the name Instant City. They remembered that not all wealth came from the rivers. Levi Strauss had built enduring enterprise from durable denim trousers designed for miners who tore ordinary clothing against gravel and rock. Merchants who supplied tools and food often prospered more steadily than prospectors who sought glittering chance. They remembered ghost towns, settlements that had sprung up with confidence only to empty when deposits waned. Wooden storefronts stood silent where once saloons rang with noise. Wind moved through abandoned doorways. Nature reclaimed streets that had briefly carried the weight of ambition. They remembered conflict. Native Californian communities displaced from ancestral lands, foreign miners taxed and harassed, vigilance committees enforcing order with uncertain legitimacy. The gold rush had not been uniform triumph, it had been complex transformation. San Francisco continued evolving long after the rush subsided. The Golden Gate Strait remained passageway to global trade rather than solely to goldfields. The harbour, once chaotic with deserted vessels, became organised maritime centre. The city's appetite for innovation persisted. The first mechanical slot machine would eventually be invented there, reflecting enduring fascination with risk and reward that traced back to mining days. Cultural symbols endured. The Hangtown Fry remained on menus as culinary reminder of sudden fortune. Denim trousers became global garment, far removed from their riverbank origins. Stories of early camps entered textbooks and folklore. The state of California, propelled into union with unusual speed, grew into economic and political power. Agriculture, railroads, industry, and trade diversified its economy. The Transcontinental Railroad linked Pacific Coast to eastern states, binding nation more tightly together. Environmental scars from hydraulic mining remained visible in certain hillsides, reminders that progress carries cost. Legal battles over water and land shaped later policy. Debates over immigration and inclusion continued to echo early tensions. If you had arrived in California in 1849, believing that gold alone defined its future, would you have imagined how many other forms of wealth would emerge? Wheat fields, rail lines, universities, technology, each rooted in a moment when rivers first drew global attention. The gold rush did not simply create fortunes, it created momentum. It accelerated migration, reshaped demographics, and embedded California within national and international networks. It revealed both generosity and prejudice, innovation and exploitation. For those who survived its hardships, the experience remained formative. Some returned east with modest savings and stories. Others stayed and built communities. Many adjusted expectations and discovered that stability, rather than sudden wealth, defined lasting success. History often simplifies events into singular narratives. The gold rush becomes symbol of opportunity, of daring individuals seizing chance. Yet lived reality resists simplicity. It includes scarcity alongside abundance, cooperation alongside conflict, endurance alongside ambition. Perhaps the most enduring legacy lies not in the ounces of gold extracted, but in the patterns of movement established. The idea that California could reinvent identity persisted long after the last major deposits were worked. Migration continued in waves. Railroad workers, farmers, entrepreneurs, dreamers, each generation carrying its own version of hope. If you had stood beside that first quiet mill race and watched a glint in the water, could you have foreseen cities rising, railroads stretching, industries forming. Could you have anticipated ghost towns and buried ships beneath future financial districts? The gold rush did not offer certainty. It offered possibility, shaped by human choice and circumstance. The rivers are quieter now. Imagine the sound of water moving steadily over stones, not hurried, not crowded. The camps have faded into memory. The saloons have dimmed their lamps. The abandoned ships beneath San Francisco's streets rest undisturbed. California continues to grow, to reinvent, to debate how progress should look. Yet beneath highways and farmland, beneath cities and orchards, lie traces of that earlier moment when thousands believed they could begin again. You can almost picture a miner kneeling beside the American river, not certain what the day will bring. He does not know the future. He only knows the present task before him. Perhaps that is where the gold rush still speaks to us, not in the promise of sudden wealth, but in the quiet recognition that history is built from ordinary decisions taken in extraordinary times. As you settle into rest tonight, let the sound of that river carry you gently forward,